I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today is a part of our Lu Xun series that we've been looking forward to because it's kind of the most classic Lu Xun story ever.
This is the story that everyone knows about.
This and Diary of a Madman, right?
But even then, I would argue A Q even more so. I mean, even in Chinese culture, you have something like A Q Jingshen, like A Q spirit, A Q something, A Q-ism sometimes, right? Diary of a Madman doesn't have that kind of cachet, right? I mean, it's still incredibly important, but not quite the same thing.
I think maybe it's fair to say that Diary of a Madman, the Kuangren Riji, was more revolutionary for its time. A Q has maybe had a slightly longer lasting influence.
And I think the reason for that is that the titular character of this story is so much harder to parse than a lot of critics and commentators either realize or will argue. I mean, the standard way to discuss Lu Xun is always in the context of his Chineseness, right? So he's the great Chinese writer. He spoke to the Chinese spirit, the Chinese struggle, and all that. But for all that, if you really just read this story, you get to the end and you go, wait, so how am I supposed to read this character? Is he a complete clown? Are we supposed to be sympathetic? Is he tragic? Are we supposed to think he's an idiot and dismiss him? There's so many ways to read him.
I think we're already getting too insider baseball. Rob, can you just introduce the story?
I'm going to do my best. And the reason I say that is because this is a surprisingly difficult story to summarize because it's both just a series of vignettes and it's also a single story whose ending is very, very different from the rest of the story in terms of form, in terms of content. So the whole thing, the true story of A Q is the story of, was the unofficial biography of a nobody, a guy in a village, Chinese character A, English letter Q, much has been made of this. He's an idiot and kind of a joke for whom everything fails, nothing works, and yet he always manages or in his own head to turn that into a great victory. So, for example, in the beginning of the story, he claims kinship with one of the noble families in the area, the Zhaos. One of the Zhao clan doesn't appreciate this and beats the snot out of him. And A Q, who's, been beaten to a pulp, drags himself back to his lodgings in the Buddhist temple. And as he goes, he says to himself, though, that wasn't really a beating, right? That was a kind of like a disciplining, right? That's what family members do, right? You discipline each other to make each other better.
So he claims to be related. I mean, still he claims some sort of relation to the Zhaos, and he kind of like gets some face, I guess is the right word, some mianzi.
And one of the things that I love about the story it is very bleakly funny. And one of the adventures that he has is he decides, you know what, I've gone low enough, and he finds this louse-ridden beggar and decides he's going to insult that guy and at least be higher than the louse-ridden beggar. The beggar doesn't appreciate it, gets up, gets in a fight. A Q loses that too.
This is the fight with Xiao Di, right?
Yeah, which is frankly kind of funny in a not funny way. I don't know how else to say that. The story goes on like that. He loses, but in his mind he wins, etc. And then
there are several times that he harasses women, some of which he gets in trouble for, some of which he kind of is able to pull off without getting reprimanded or punished for.
But even when he gets away with it, he's always sort of cheered on. Those of you who go to high school and there was a kid that was kind of a laughing stock and they attempted to do something cool and was clearly failing. Everyone still cheered him on anyway because it was sort of funny. Very uncomfortable. But history overtakes A Q and his village.
And this is, for me, the point where the story really goes from, Rob, what you called sort of sad funny, I think, to
bleakly funny. Yeah.
Bleakly funny to a sort of dark sense of a foreboding that has really no humor for me. The humor goes out in the final part of this story. And keep in mind, this is an episodic novella, so it was written in different stages and published in different stages. So Lu Xun is kind of changing things up right here at the end. The end, when history catches up, is 1911. The revolution happens. There's a revolution in China. The Qing dynasty is overthrown. The last of China's 2 millennia long imperial dynasties comes to an end. And A Q tries to get involved with some of the intrigues. He tries to join a group of revolutionaries. They They don't really let him, but again, it's AQ, so he thinks it's a victory for him. He thinks of himself as having joined the revolutionaries, and he claims to have joined the revolutionaries. And then the novel or novella ends with him being arrested and carted off to the Yamen, the government office, and he's worried about how he's going to sign his name on the confession. He doesn't actually, he's not able to sign it, so he tries to draw a circle, but he's anxious about not being able to draw a perfect circle. All the time, he doesn't realize, oh, I'm being taken off to be executed. And even when he finishes, he even fails at being executed. He is executed, I guess. I mean, the novella doesn't really tell us, but he tries to entertain the crowd as his last act by singing some Chinese opera, and even that he can't do really well. So he's just a complete, utter failure, and that's where the novel ends.
Well, what I should point out, though, and this should maybe get into more of the discussion about this story and why this is so fascinating on so many levels, is that he's full of talk through the whole story. Full of talk, until they finally arrest him. From the point they arrest him until the end of the story, almost the only thing he says is yes or no. So at one point he says, I can't write. But once they actually cart him off, he has nothing to say. He's even addressed several times, and he doesn't know what to say. It's like he loses the ability to respond altogether. And at the very, very end, so he's looking out at this crowd. Everyone's cheering. It's a spectacle. People are being executed. They're all cheering. It says, AQ looked back at the cheering crowd. We're using Julia Lovell's translation. Now, what happens after that, you would be expecting... he looked at the crowd, they looked back, the executioner came in, and whatever. But there's nothing. He has this memory of having encountered a hungry wolf that followed him, and how terrifying that was, and how scary the wolf's eyes looked, and maybe it kind of looks like this crowd. And then you get these lines, a monstrous coalition of eyes gnawing into his soul. Then there's a quote, help. Here's the next line, but AQ said nothing. His eyes were blind, his ears were buzzing, as if his body was scattered into so much dust. This is why, for me, Lu Xun is a genius. Because this would have been the easiest story in the world to just end with a standard execution scene. Instead, what you get is one of the most perplexing endings I've ever read in a short story. Because I think we can assume he was executed, but who said help? The line has no speaker. It doesn't say AQ said help. It just says there's a sea of faces. Then you have this disembodied quote, help. And then the next line is, but AQ said nothing. So what in the world is happening there? And this is why it's so frustrating to me sometimes when I read about Lu Xun as sort of the great revolutionary, people trying essentially to make him a very simplistic writer, because this does not afford that kind of simplistic interpretation.
One of the things I wanted to emphasize in this podcast is that epistemological questions, that is, questions of knowing, how do you know what you know? You think you know something, but do you really know it? That seems to be at the forefront of what Lu Xun is doing. And you're right, Rob, there is this kind of standard reading of Lu Xun's AQ in the PRC, that is, AQ is the essential Chinese man. To put it in another way, he's the China man. That's not China man.
We're not saying that, right?
Yeah. But in the same way that Davos man is a type, he is the man who represents China. That's fine for what it's worth, but the story is so rich with so much more. The story begins with the narrator discussing he doesn't know really that much about AQ. He doesn't know where he got his name. He doesn't even know if his last name is Zhao. I mean, he relates the story about him getting beaten up by the Zhao family. But then he goes, but I don't even know if Zhao is his last name. He also starts out by saying he doesn't even know what to call this story, because the true story of AQ, that Zhen Zhuan, is not really a good way to describe anything. I mean, he's kind of making this language up, but it doesn't fit within the previous genres of telling history. And he kind of hesitates all over the place about these different questions. Is this a true story? Is this a biography? Is this a biography of a famous person? Is this an unofficial biography? There are all these kinds of questions of how do you know something? And this is Lu Xun right here in 1921 when he's writing the story. December 1921, I think, to February 1922 is when it was published. And he's thinking about what it means to know something and what it means to know something in the modern world. I mean, China, over a decade before, it left the imperial era and it went into the quote-unquote modern era. And he's trying to understand, how do those categories, the ways we write history, how do those apply in this modern era? I mean, China's been writing history arguably for more than 2,000 years, and they have these examples, and they're kind of baked into the way of thinking about this stuff in a Chinese context. But now he's breaking the mold.
This is why the first section is also super interesting, because the narrator basically spends time saying, I really wanted to tell this guy's story. Is this an authorized biography or not? Like, he's invoking this genre, right? So I thought maybe I'd use this genre, except why in the world would you write an authorized biography about a village idiot? There's no reason to do that.
Nobody. Why would you do that?
Nobody. Like a complete buffoon and clown who got executed for not being a revolution. Like, there's no reason to dedicate something like this to him. But then, of course, this is why it's classic Lu Xun, right? So now, is that because this guy didn't deserve to have something right about him and it's kind of ironic? Or is it because the genre itself is in question, right? Is it because all the stuff you have read in this genre is questionable anyway, so why not just throw this guy in there? And you can read it either way.
Again, it's about how you know what you know.
Right, exactly. And this is why I kind of love the ending of this story. The last section of this story is one of my favorite pieces of literature, full stop. But I tend to think the people who read this story as a straight-ahead political commentary tend to not read the last part of the story, because if you stop just with his adventures and you also accept that this is meant to be a biography of a guy, right? You read it just like if you read something like Miss Sophie's Diary as a straight-up, this is definitely a diary and not anything else, it can feel kind of simple, right? This is a guy who is trying to say that all the bad stuff that's happened to him is not that bad. It's actually a victory, right? So Lu Xun definitely felt this. This is something that Chinese scholars, Chinese writers, people struggled with towards the end of the Qing, going, hang on, no, we're not getting pushed around. It's actually something different, see, because like all the great stuff that the West knows, that actually came from us anyway. So yeah, so we actually are kind of beating ourselves.
I should point out that Lu Xun on several occasions was asked, why did you write the story of A Q based on me? And he just kind of laughed and goes, I didn't base it off of you. A bunch of people have asked me why I based the story on them. It's just that it's such a paradigmatic example of a typical Chinese male at this time that it really resonates with a lot of folks.
I don't know when we're going to air our interview with Professor Carolyn Brown. In that discussion, which you will either have heard before this or will hear, she mentions that Lu Xun, in many of his greatest fiction, was both the paradigmatic Chinese writer and a kind of universal voice at the same time, which is to say, if you want to read this in terms of Chinese history, there's plenty to work with there, right? But there's always something that escapes that as well. And the end of this story, after all of his buffoonish adventures are over, and he's being carted off to death without knowing where he's going, it gets stranger and stranger, and then just ends in this episode where nothing is as it seems, and all of a sudden it's not a straight-ahead political anything. And, we talk about ways of knowing. At the very end, if you're writing a straight-ahead biography, biographies have an end. The person's dead. You write about how they died. That's how it works. You don't write an ending like this where, first of all, how in the world would you know what went through his mind? the narrator starts the piece by saying, I didn't really know enough about really a lot about this guy. And then at the very end, he's still able to narrate a memory he had about a wolf. Yeah, that's not possible. Right? And it's fascinating that Lu Xun puts that in like the last paragraph or like the second to last paragraph. So maybe you're reading along and maybe you've bought into this idea of, oh, it's kind of a biography. Fair enough. And then, yeah, that's not biography. That's objectively not biography. You can't possibly say that because he's all alone on this execution ground.
It's fiction, right? Like he's playing with the idea of fiction, genre, all of these questions of how is it possible to know this stuff? But he's drawing off this traditional Chinese literary orientation towards history, and he's even questioning, what is the relevance of history? What is the relevance of biography? What is the relevance of telling real people's stories? Can we know any of this stuff? We've had several thousand years where history has told us that we can, like the thing to do for literature is mostly to talk about great men. What if we have this nobody? For several thousand years, history has told us we can know this stuff, that this stuff is kind of set in stone. But can we really know it?
He does that both by writing within that genre and writing against that genre at the same time. In the same way that Diary of a Madman is both a diary and very much not a diary. And the same way some of his other great fiction is very much what it claims to be and very much not what it claims to be. This is why when you mentioned people were saying, wow, yeah, that must have been me in that story. And he laughs and goes, yeah, no, it's not you. It's just me. It's stuff I'm dealing with, right? I wanted to throw this in too. One of the things that I find fascinating if you read across all of Lu Xun's career is a tendency to sort of almost sabotage his own fiction. Let me clarify that. I don't mean sabotage it like now it's no good anymore, but he'll set a premise and then pull the rug out from under that premise, either at the end of the story or in the middle, somewhere, right? There is throughout Lu Xun's career a real lack of maybe assurance. Early on, when he first starts writing fiction and submitting it once again in 1916 and 17, he has to kind of be talked into it because he's given up the whole thing as a wash. Like, nah, forget it. No way. It's not going to do anything. And then later on, towards the end of the 20s, he sort of comes back to that point of view and goes, nah, forget it. I'm just going to write little essays and blurbs from now on. Even in his best fiction, there are moments when he seems to say to himself, the thing is, if I make this a straight-ahead political commentary, it's not going to hit the way I want it to hit. Because that's not actually me. There's still some part of him that doesn't believe this is going to change the world. By far the best is to present people with a piece of literature that's going to defy them, that's going to defy any kind of simple interpretation and make them think. Not have a simple conclusion like, wow, we got to not be like AQ. No, this story is more complicated than that. And there's a reason people keep coming back to it, because you can enjoy the story and laugh here and there, but there's a whole lot more that's just going to escape you.
The final words that AQ possibly utters, we don't know who says it, but it only makes sense if it is AQ, that is Jiuming, save, help, save me, save my life, are very, very similar to the other story of Lu Xun's that we mentioned back at the beginning, The Diary of a Madman. The final words in that are 救救孩子, that is, save the children. There is something interesting going on that both of these stories end on a note of salvation or possible salvation or failed salvation. I think that the traditional reading in the PRC in China is that these stories offer a ray of hope. I don't really see that.
I don't either. I mean, I can see the logic behind that. Help, save me. Like there's someone may come to save you, right? Except that the person crying out for help is clearly not going to get any help because he's never had any help. And that's the whole point. There's a kind of existential angst at the best of Lu Xun's work that manages to be sort of funny, and then later on, like the Iron House analogy all over again. You can yell all you want, but no one's getting out of the house anyway.
Rob, we did the Halloween podcast that was sort of a teaser for this on White Light, and that has a similar kind of ending where you don't really know what happens. I mean, it's clear that in the story of the White Light, Chen Shicheng dies, but we don't know what's going on exactly. There's the same kind of like someone says something right at the end, but it's not clear if it's Chun who's saying that or someone else. There's just so much ambiguity. One of the things I want the listener to take away from this is, so Lu Xun, I think, is the greatest modern writer in Chinese literature. Now, I am on record as saying he's not the greatest writer in Chinese in the 20th century. That's Zhang Ailing. And I still stand by that. But I think that one thing that has not been done enough is for readers to go to Lu Xun and think of him as a modernist writer. That is, he is writing in the style of modernism. The Julia Lovell translation is titled The Real Story of A Q and Other Tales of China, the Complete Fiction of Lu Xun. And if you look on the cover, it's got a young boy in this traditional Chinese garb. He's facing away from the painter. And it's this kind of orientalistic vision of China. Lu Xun is not old China or whatever. He's not this kind of like writer of these old tales. He fits within the framework of Joyce, of Proust, of all those other authors of modernism. And I think that y'all should think of him in that way. Don't take this kind of vision of him as just this quaint Chinese guy who's writing stories. Don't take the PRC vision of him either, of he describes all of the ills of modern China and the way to overcome them. I think you have to think of him as China's Joyce, China's Proust.
And the thing is, though, even if you were to see him as the writer who's telling the Chinese people how to overcome these problems, the way to overcome them is so convoluted and strange and defiant of explanation, or at least clear explanation, that the solution is to simply think, to simply be more than you are. That's very much a modernist challenge, which is all the things you think you know, the ways you think you know them, you probably don't. That's the way out, is not to get rid of old superstitions or read new stuff. No, it's much, much more than that. And I'm not even going to tell you exactly what it is. That's something you're just going to have to figure out for themselves. And that is just huge.
I think that's a great place to end it, Rob. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.